Did you know that Jesus in the Gospels talks a lot more about money than he does about prayer? Is that a surprise? Ken Bailey, who writes a lot or wrote a lot about the Proverbs and seeing Jesus through Middle Eastern eyes, comments on a number of Jesus' parables and Jesus' teachings about money about that fact. He said Jesus was always talking about money, much more frequently than he talked about, say, prayer. And he wonders why that was the case. You'd expect it, and I read this on Monday or Tuesday, you'd expect it from the development officer of your local church college. And lo and behold, on Tuesday night we get a call from Calvin. But you really don't expect it from the Savior of the world. And yet, Jesus talks a lot about money and financial concerns and economics. And this story, this passage that we just read is kind of an application sort of sermon on the parable that Jesus had just told immediately before this about the farmer who had the barns, who couldn't contain the crops, and said to himself he'd tear them down and build new ones. And while that was a frightening story, if you remember it, and I suspect most of you do remember it. We didn't read it, but it's something that you don't forget. I'm wondering if anyone here has had similar sorts of thoughts, whether looking at your property you've thought, boy, I could really use some more room for, and then you fill in the blank. You know what happened to me this morning? I've been thinking about knocking out the back wall of my garage so I have more room for my shop. And I don't need more room, I just have too much stuff. And so even as I'm going over the sermon thinking about this wicked man who's going to build more barns, I find myself thinking about how I'd pour the slab and move the wall back. You don't have to be a prosperous farmer with big barns to read this parable about the prosperous farmer with big barns and get a poke in the eye. Just about all of us do. Just about all of us are familiar with that desire for more, that ambition, that greed. Well, we're still on this upside-down journey to the cross. It began with Jesus setting his face toward Jerusalem, and it continues as he shows us how to die to what the world calls the good life in order that we're able to receive what Jesus calls abundant life, in order that we can live the life that God in Jesus Christ has intended for us. And it continues to be counterintuitive, it continues to be countercultural, and it may feel like trying to walk on our hands. I don't know if we have anyone here this morning who's able to still walk on your hands. I don't think I ever managed a cartwheel myself. We're meant to walk on our feet. That's where the strength is. But as we follow Jesus, he turns us upside down. He turns our values upside down. And we will see yet again how that happens as we look through this application of the story of the farmer and the barns. Verse 22, when Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes." And this is how Jesus makes the bridge from the barn story to the sermon that is to come. And what struck me as curious are the words that Jesus uses to talk about one, food, and two, clothing. About food, in your Bibles you see the word life. And the Greek word that is translated there is psyche. It's not the first word that comes to mind when we think of of life. Psyche, we know from psychiatrists, psychologists, psychiatry, or getting psyched up for things. And psyche seems to have to do with the life of the mind, at least the way it's come down to us in English. Soma is the word in Greek for body, and that refers to body. That's pretty straightforward. In English, the two words come together for us when we talk about psychosomatic illnesses. People who are ill have some kind of physical malady, but the cause for that malady isn't found in the body, but it's found in their heads, in their psyches. I bring all this up because Jesus uses these words and this stuff almost interchangeably, life or psyche and body, and he does so to get after that question that we asked at the very beginning: why is it that Jesus talks about money so much? Well, it's because there isn't that division that we assume there is between the spiritual life and material life. There is no division between the life of the mind and the life of stuff. It is all one whole. And so Jesus talks about money because how we use money is a matter of spiritual formation, just as much as bowing our head or getting down on our knees. And it's one of the things that this passage shows us. It's one of the things that so much of Jesus' teaching tells us, is that our life is an integrated whole. We're quickly dividing it into different pieces, or we often do: material world, spiritual world. But in Jesus' hands, it comes together. And he doesn't let us divide parts of it off. It all has to do with how we live the life that God intends us to live. Well, we're beginning this morning with birds, with the comparison that Jesus has to make about our concern about what we eat and the birds of heaven. The farmer had been blessed with ample crops. Food is at the heart of any basic economy, providing for yourself, for your family, for your community. That's often summed up by the whole notion of putting food on the table, right? When we think of ourselves as providing, when we think of all the things that we need in order to live, we often sum that up with the whole notion of putting food on the table. But we live in a place and a time where food takes up an amazingly small part of our budget. But for so much of the world, that percentage of income that is required is so much higher. I don't know if you've listened this week to interviews with farmers in Iowa or Nebraska. If you have, you've heard anxiety in their voices too, not just about their food supply, but about your food supply. The floods have destroyed last year's crop as it sits in the silos, and I heard one talk about how as the floodwaters rose around the silos, that dry grain began to absorb moisture, and there were slow motion explosions as the storage facilities for the grain expanded and were blown apart by the water that crept up. And so last year's crop is lost and destroyed. And as they look out over their fields, they see that the waters will not recede on time for this year's crop. And so they anticipate a couple of years of crop loss, a couple of years of losing their income on top of the property damage that happens. And so you think, well, if anybody has a right to worry about their food, it would be them, right? And by comparison, a lot of our concerns, a lot of our worries seem a little bit petty when you see a couple years of everything you've done wiped out. And yet the advice that Jesus gives, the word that he has for those farmers in Iowa and Nebraska, and for us right here in the pews of Plymouth Heights Christian Reformed Church, is the same. Look at the birds. Look at the birds. They don't sow, they don't cultivate, they don't harvest. They just show up. And interestingly, here in Luke, the birds that are chosen are the ravens. The ravens are the ones that you see sitting on the dead animals out there, picking away. I like to think of vegetarian birds myself, of those happy little birds, or maybe the nectar drinkers, the hummingbirds. I've seen lots of the ravens on roadkill this week, and come to think of it, it won't be long before we see the robins pulling up those long worms from the ground and sucking them down. And on Monday, a beautiful afternoon this week, I paddled up the Grand River, and I saw a red-headed woodpecker land on a dead tree and stick its head way into a hole, looking for grubs or insects or whatever it is they eat. Jesus says, look at them. They didn't put any of that stuff there. They didn't build barns, and yet God provides for them. Know that He will provide for you as well. You who were created in His image, you who are of so much more value to Him than any of those beautiful birds that we might see. He'll take care of you. He'll provide for you. Not only does God care for us more, His image bearers, than He does the birds, but Jesus says something else that we all know to be true. Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to your life? Not a single one. In fact, we probably shorten it in proportion to all the time that we spend worrying about it. From the birds and the ravens, Jesus directs our attention to the flowers. Soon the church will be full of Easter lilies. Not too long ago it was poinsettias. What Jesus had in mind here, I think, was probably fields of wildflowers that popped up after the rains, where it had been barren and brown. All of a sudden, fields of beautiful color. And those fields would disappear just as quickly as they appeared, but while they were there, they were glorious and beautiful, unimaginable in their beauty. As I thought about that, I found myself wondering if Jesus ever worried about His appearance. You think Jesus ever got up in the morning and thought, oh, my beard's too long? Or, oh, it's about time to wash my hair again. Or these clothes, ooh, they're a little ripe. We tend to think of Jesus, don't we, as though He were always ready for that Sunday school photographer to take His picture so it could be hung on all the walls of all the Sunday school rooms and all the churches in all the world, where He's got the light coming down on Him and He's all clean and happy. But Jesus, being fully human, must have been, at the very least, conversant with our anxieties about how we look. Because when we get up in the morning, it's really not a matter of whether there's enough cloth in the house to cover our bodies, is it? I mean, we got enough cloth to cover ourselves. We can go out and be warm and dressed and all that stuff. It's more a concern about how we look, which is a concern about how we fit, which is a concern about whether we belong or not. And so Jesus tells us that of course we belong. Of course we are beautiful. That we needn't spend all that time that we spend either shopping or looking in the mirror or trying to appear as good as we possibly can. That hunger for approval, that hunger for acceptance, that need to be welcomed and embraced, that's met by our Father in heaven. He gives that to us from the very outset. The beauty is there, the belonging is there, and you don't have to earn it with your appearance. Well, Jesus moves from the birds to the flowers to the little lambs. Not many of us, I'm willing to wager, see ourselves as little lambs. And yet when Jesus goes on to address his followers as his little flock, he's using this endearing diminutive, my little ones. There's warmth and affection in his voice, but there's sympathy too. Little ones, why do you worry so much about things over which you have absolutely no control? Please, don't be so concerned. And then he goes on to talk about his Father's pleasure. What makes his Father happy is to provide the things that his little ones need, to give exactly what we need most. And those of you who are parents or grandparents or aunts or uncles, think of giving gifts to little children. And what a delight it is to see them tear them open and receive with joy and gladness what you have prepared for them. It gives God the same pleasure to provide what we need. Somehow we want it on our own. At the end of the bird section, Jesus had given the familiar admonition to seek first the kingdom of God, and all the other needs you may have will be provided as well. And what that means is this: be faithful, be obedient, be responsible, be compassionate, and don't worry. You know, any purse or wallet that we may have, any bank account you may build up, any investment you may make, I mean, there isn't a one of them that hasn't proved to be difficult or leaky. A purse may wear out and you may find yourself with all your coins slipping out the back of it. Or an investment account may go belly up with the failure of companies in which it was invested. Any imaginable number of things can go wrong. And so here Jesus talks about putting your money in purses that don't wear out. And St. Augustine identified some of those purses that didn't wear out, and he said they were the bellies of the poor. Put your money in the stomachs of the hungry, and that investment will never disappear. St. Augustine essentially was saying what Jesus says here: sell your possessions and give to the poor, provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So I guess it comes down to finding a home for your heart. Where can your heart find peace and rest? Where can it stop pacing and fretting and worrying? Where can you finally feed once and for all that anxious need that is in your stomach or your heart or your head? I had breakfast with Kumar Sanaya a couple of weeks ago, and we usually get together after his trip to Nepal with Calvin students, medical and nursing students, and he takes them to a clinic or a series of clinics and churches there to show some of what goes on in very different circumstances. And he told me a story while we were having breakfast that seemed to fit particularly well, and he wrote that up, and I'd like to conclude with that story now. It goes like this. This is the story of Erica, a nurse at Spectrum, who went on a short trip to Nepal and heard God's calling for her life. While on her first journey to Nepal for a visit, she had this desire to go to church before she left Nepal. She got this opportunity the day before she left. At church, Erica met another American woman who was running an organization called Beauty for Ashes, an organization that works with marginalized and trafficked women by providing skills and giving these women an independent life. This woman suggested to Erica the need for someone to come work alongside her in the organization in Nepal. Erica was convinced that God was calling her to go to work in Nepal. Upon her return to Grand Rapids, she prayed fervently to the Lord to guide her in this decision. There was one problem, though. Erica had been struggling with narcolepsy in the U.S. Narcolepsy is a sleep disorder, and the only way she was able to work here was with the drugs that helped her control this condition. Erica checked to see if the drugs that she needed would be available in Nepal, and none were available. Yet she had this strong calling to go and serve with Beauty for Ashes. She prayed to God that since it was His calling for her, He would have to deal with her narcolepsy in Nepal. Erica arrived in Nepal to work at Beauty for Ashes that year, and her narcolepsy was completely taken away from her. She never had to use the medicines, nor was her condition returned while she has been in Nepal. God gave Erica a clear sign that she needed to know that He was with her. One of the things that Erica challenged Calvin students who were visiting Nepal was to give space and time to God when they got back to the United States. She said, "It's hard to hear God's voice in the U.S. Our lives are filled with too much noise." In Nepal, she's dependent on God for everything. When her motorcycle breaks down, she can only cry out to God and ask for help. In everything, she's become utterly dependent on God. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Let's bow together in prayer.